For years now, it feels like we've all been scrolling past certain headlines, just flicking past news about Russia's actions near its borders, maybe cyber attacks, reports of troops massing.
Yeah, it definitely felt like that.
For a long time, it just seemed like, well, like background noise, didn't it?
It really did.
Mm.
And the source material we've been digging into uses this really powerful, almost uncomfortable analogy for that. It's the frog in boiling water.
Ah, right.
Drop it in suddenly, it jumps out.
Yeah.
But heat the water slowly. Well, it doesn't realize the danger until it's way too late.
Oof.
And the suggestion here, which is pretty stark, is that the West might just be that frog right now.
Okay, wow, that's a bracing thought to start with. And layered on top of that, that sort of slow boil tension, the sources point to something else really significant, a real strain on those, longstanding transatlantic partnerships. That feeling, maybe for the first time in memory for a lot of us, that the United States,
The traditional safety net.
exactly, that safety net might be perceived at least as questioning commitments, maybe stepping back a bit.
And that perception, I mean, regardless of the day-to-day reality, that perception is forcing a huge change in thinking for European leaders. The sources really emphasize this shift.
How so?
For the first time in decades, they're truly grappling with the idea, the possibility of needing to defend themselves without their, well, traditional most powerful ally being fully engaged in the same way.
Right.
It's framed in these materials not just as like a policy tweak, but a real warning.
Yeah.
A fundamental rethinking of what war, peace, and even survival mean for the continent now.
So, okay. Based on this stack of source materials you've pulled together for this deep dive, our mission seems pretty clear.
Yeah.
We need to really unpack how Europe is responding to this seismic shift,
Yeah.
this growing threat of war, as the sources put it.
We need to understand the nature of these new complex threats first.
And then dive into the very specific, sometimes surprising preparations being made right across the continent, all drawn directly from these sources we have.
Absolutely. To understand the response, you have to start with the threat itself. And the sources are pretty much unified on this point. The battlefield isn't just changing geographically, it's changing fundamentally.
In what way?
Russia, in particular, isn't sticking to the old playbooks. They're playing what's described here as multidimensional chess. It's way beyond just conventional warfare.
Right. And while the conventional stuff still makes headlines, tanks and troops, the sources remind us it's just one piece of a bigger puzzle. You see the reports, like over 30,000 Russian troops near the Suwalki Gap, that really narrow corridor between Poland and Lithuania, keeps the Baltic states nervous.
Understandably.
And the sources mention those Zapad exercises before the full-scale invasion in 22, simulating capturing Baltic capitals in, under 60 hours?
Scary fast. Yeah. It's conventional force, sure, but the sources say it's wielded with a very clear, sharp political edge.
But the really eye-opening part reading through these sources is how deeply integrated the other domains are. Russia's cyber capabilities, for instance.
They're significant. We all remember the 2007 attack on Estonia. Right. Shut down their digital backbone.
Yeah, that was huge.
But these sources highlight it's not a one-off thing. There's regular probing, constant testing of European power grids, banking systems, government networks. It's persistent.
And that attack that disabled Ukraine's satellite communications just before the 2022 invasion, the sources are saying that's now chillingly kind of standard operating procedure for them.
It seems to be part of the toolkit now, yes.
And let's not forget the energy weapon.
Oh, definitely not.
The sources detail how, before the war really exposed the scale of dependency, Russia controlled something like 40% of Europe's natural gas.
A huge lever.
And they weren't shy about using it for political leverage, were they? Germany's sudden, almost frantic construction of LNG terminals.
It wasn't just about green energy targets, no.
The sources state pretty clearly it was driven by an immediate need for survival, pure and simple.
And what really brings this home, though, reading this material, is how these multidimensional tactics connect directly to you, the listener, to your daily life.
How so?
It's not just abstract military strategy happening somewhere else. These sources highlight that these threats translate into potential blackouts, real economic pressure, disruptions that go way beyond a traditional front line.
Affecting hospitals, transport.
Communications, everything, that background noise we talked about.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the sources argue it becomes very tangible, everyday risk.
Okay, so Russia presents this dynamic, multi-layered threat. But the sources also spend a lot of time on another major player, China. Specifically, China's expanding influence in Europe.
Yes, and it's described as going way beyond just, standard trade deals.
Right.
Beijing has been very strategically building an economic foothold. The sources point out China owns significant stakes in, get this, 14 major European ports.
14, wow. Like Piraeus in Greece.
Piraeus, the container terminal in Hamburg, Germany. Key hubs. And the insight here, according to the sources, isn't just about business investment. It's framed as Beijing gaining a genuine strategic foothold on the continent.
And then there's the tech transfer issue. The sources use some pretty strong language here.
They do. They talk about a hemorrhaging of critical tech knowledge from European universities and firms straight to Chinese partners.
Like what kind of tech?
Think advanced AI research from German universities, or maybe sensitive semiconductor designs from Dutch labs. The sources say this know-how can end up in Chinese military or surveillance applications, often faster than any export controls can possibly react. And it's not just economic or tech influence either. The sources also note China's military activities are increasingly visible outside Asia.
Such as?
Well, they mention joint naval exercises with Russia, right there in the Baltic Sea.
And the Baltics?
And these so-called research vessels, often suspected of intelligence gathering, monitoring NATO activities in the Mediterranean. Plus, their growing global surveillance network, which apparently tracks European military and even civilian movements.
So while Europe might often view China primarily as, a trade partner, maybe a competitor.
The sources strongly suggest Beijing sees Europe quite differently, as the soft underbelly of Western power, a place ripe for influence, strategic investment, and what the sources call subtle disruption.
Subtle disruption.
They're not just playing a short game here. The analysis suggests they're playing a long game without firing a shot.
Okay, so you've got these complex threats from state actors, Russia and China, but then there's another layer adding to the anxiety.
Yeah, the sources see this deeply worrying trend. The weakening of the global frameworks, the rules and agreements that used to provide at least some predictability, some stability.
That's a point the sources really emphasize, and they draw a pretty ominous parallel.
It's the 1930s.
Well, they mention the echoes, yeah. They talk about the death or near death of crucial arms control treaties, the INF Treaty, Open Skies, the Struggling START Treaty.
These aren't just, dusty documents.
No. The sources describe it as a really dangerous slide back towards a world where, basically, military might trumps legal agreements. Power politics, writ large.
And this trend naturally raises fundamental questions about the international institutions that were actually designed to prevent major conflict.
Like the UN Security Council.
Exactly. The sources highlight its paralysis, often gridlocked by Russian and Chinese vetoes, plus, unpredictability from other major powers, too.
And the World Trade Organization.
Struggling to resolve even basic trade disputes effectively.
Yeah.
And even NATO, which is supposed to be the bedrock of security.
It's facing internal fractures.
The sources cite examples, like actions by Turkey or Hungary, that make that core mutual defense guarantee feel at times increasingly shaky. That's the phrase they use.
So the picture painted by these sources isn't really a return to the Cold War, is it? Not with clear blocks and rules, however dangerous those were.
No, it's different. They describe it more as a brewing free-for-all, a much more chaotic environment where potential aggressors can exploit vulnerabilities across all these different domains, cyber, economic, information.
While trying to stay just below the threshold that would trigger, like, a big open war?
Precisely. It's a strategy of constant pressure, probing weaknesses, without necessarily crossing that final red line.
Okay, so given this really complex threat picture and the fraying international rulebook, the crucial question is, how is Europe actually responding?
And the sources are very clear on this. Europe isn't acting like a single bloc. Not at all.
Right, it's a patchwork.
It's a patchwork of different histories, different geographies, different perceptions of who the main threat is. So the responses, even though they're aimed at continent-wide threats, are deeply regional.
So to understand it, the sources say we need to zoom in, region by region.
That's the best way to grasp it, yeah. Let's start where the threat feels, well, most immediate and acute. The Eastern Front.
Poland, for instance.
Poland is described as doing more than just, building up its army. It's assembling a fortress. That's the term used.
A fortress, what does that mean in practice?
The sources detail their ambition, aiming for what could be Europe's largest land army by 2040. Over 300,000 personnel.
300,000?
Yeah. Committing over 4% of their GDP to defense. Buying hundreds of tanks, HIMARS rocket launchers, F-35 jets, Apache helicopters, mostly from the U.S. and South Korea.
They're serious.
The source states pretty bluntly, actually, that Warsaw's preparing not for a war, but the war.
Wow. Okay, and further north, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
They've embraced this concept called total defense,
Huh.
which sounds dramatic, but it's quite practical.
Meaning?
It's not just military. It's about blending civilian resilience, getting the whole society involved with rapid military mobilization.
So their small size isn't just a vulnerability.
Surprisingly, the sources suggest it can be a strength. They can shift gears really fast, mobilize reserves, and volunteer defense leagues within hours.
And civilians get involved how?
The sources mention things like school children learning first aid, citizens being trained to defend critical infrastructure like power stations or bridges. The idea is in a crisis, every laptop and rifle counts.
And down on the Black Sea flank, Romania, Bulgaria.
They're reinforcing their defenses too, obviously responding to increased Russian naval activity and general geopolitical pressure in that region.
Romania is hosting more U.S. troops, right?
Yes, and making pretty significant investments in things like F-16s, missile defense systems, upgrading their navy. Bulgaria, maybe a bit slower to start, is highlighted as really waking up to the strategic urgency of protecting its coastline and its critical energy infrastructure.
Okay, let's shift northwards. The Nordic countries. They've always taken security pretty seriously, haven't they?
They really have. And now they're intensifying those preparations. Finland, of course, just joined NATO recently.
And they bring a lot to the table, the sources say.
They bring a pre-existing defense blueprint that's described as highly effective. Universal male conscription, a huge trained reserve force, and this deep-rooted culture of resilience.
Where families know where the shelters are.
Exactly. Families instinctively know shelter locations. They have basic supplies stocked. It's just part of the national mindset.
And Sweden. That was a huge shift, joining NATO in 2024 after decades of neutrality.
A hard, historic pivot. The sources detail how they're now scrambling to rebuild coastal defenses, rapidly modernize their air force, and importantly, reinstate civil defense training for the population.
There's a fascinating line in the sources about that.
About the welfare state.
Yeah. That their famous welfare state is now kind of unexpectedly training citizens not just to care, but to fight.
It's a striking way to put it, isn't it? And then there's Norway, described as a kind of silent sentinel up there.
Watching the Arctic.
Keenly watching the highest latitudes, yes. Their Arctic strategy involves defending those vital shipping lanes, closely monitoring Russian military activity in the Barents Sea.
Using advanced submarines, I read.
Advanced submarines, yes, and conducting regular joint exercises with the U.S. way up in the high north.
So you see these very distinct regional approaches, often driven by how close they are to the immediate threat. What about Western Europe?
Well, the sources note that after decades of enjoying a peace dividend,
Cashing in on peace.
the bill is now due. That's the phrase used. And its prompting was described as a rearmament revolution, although maybe one that's still finding its pace in some places.
Germany's Zeitenwende, the turning point, that got a lot of headlines.
Huge headlines. The sources call it a seismic cultural shift. After years of really chronic underspending on defense, Berlin pledged $100 billion in new investments.
$100 billion.
And they're trying to reboot their domestic arms industry. But the sources describe it as a slow march toward military credibility. It takes time.
And France. The sources suggest they never quite disarmed mentally in the same way.
That seems to be the assessment. As Europe's only nuclear power besides the UK, Paris is consistently investing in upgrading its nuclear deterrent sea and air-based.
And they project power abroad too, right?
Yeah. Flexing expeditionary muscle. Deployments in places like the Sahel and Africa, the Indo-Pacific, and increasingly troops deployed in Eastern Europe too.
There's a clear ambition there, according to the sources.
The source is presented as, France wants to lead, and it's willing to fight to prove it. Pretty direct.
Okay. And the UK post-Brexit, they seemed focused elsewhere initially.
Their big strategic review initially focused heavily on the Indo-Pacific, yeah. But the war in Ukraine fundamentally recentered their focus back onto Europe.
So they're juggling both now.
The sources describe the UK balancing both theaters, deploying aircraft carrier strike groups globally, but also significantly bolstering cyber capabilities and investing heavily in next-gen submarines and stealth aircraft for European security.
All right, let's head south, Southern Europe. The sources paint a picture of a region juggling, well, economic streams, but also proximity to some really volatile areas.
It's a good summary. Italy, for example, is described as doubling down on its defense industry,
Yeah.
leveraging its huge defense tech company, Leonardo.
They supply a lot of high-end tech across NATO.
They do. And Rome is balancing its NATO commitments with clear aspirations to step up as a leader in Europe's own defense future.
Investing in drone warfare, I saw mentioned.
Drone warfare pushing for greater interoperability among European forces, yeah.
And Spain. They were known for lower defense spending for a while.
Among the lowest in NATO, yeah.
Yeah.
But the sources say they're slowly but steadily ramping up spending and procurement now.
Focusing on
Investments in cyber defense, upgrading their navy, enhancing readiness, and contributing more to NATO missions like in the Baltics or Africa.
And then there's Greece. They're really at a complex crossroads, aren't they?
Absolutely. Sitting right at this intersection of fault lines. Ongoing tensions with Turkey, refugee flows, those energy disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean.
So they live with a constant sense of threat.
The sources suggest Greece lives with a heightened, constant sense of threat, yes. And in response, Athens is signing new defense pacts like that landmark deal with France.
Then buying new kit.
Rapidly acquiring modern platforms, Rafale fighter jets, new frigates, drones. Greece isn't waiting around. The sources show it's actively preparing, pledging something like $25 billion over the next decade.
Okay, so we have this patchwork, like you said. National efforts, regional clusters, all driven by specific threats and histories.
Right.
But the sources make a really crucial point here. These individual national efforts, on their own, probably aren't enough.
Why not?
Because threats like ballistic missiles or sophisticated cyber attacks, well, they just don't respect borders, do they?
No, of course not.
Survival, it says, requires acting together, seamlessly, rapidly, decisively. Learning survival, the sources suggest, means building a kind of united fortress.
And this is where the focus shifts to those collective preparations. Most notably, within a seriously revamped NATO.
Revamped how?
The 2022 Madrid summit is highlighted in the sources as a really pivotal moment. They announced this new force model.
Which is different from the old way.
Very different. It's not just tweaking the old system. It basically replaces the Cold War era tripwire approach, small forces just to signal an attack.
Right, a symbolic presence.
With real forward deployed firepower. The commitment now is to have over 300,000 troops at high readiness.
300,000 again.
Wow. And crucially, national units are pre-assigned to specific defense plans across the alliance territory. So they know exactly where they'd go and what they'd do in a crisis.
And those multinational battle groups, the EFP, enhanced forward presence.
They're expanding significantly. What started as 4 groups in the Baltics and Poland.
It's now growing.
Yeah, additional battle groups are setting up in Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and they're bringing heavier stuff tanks, serious air defense, combat support elements, physically much closer to Russia's doorstep.
And behind the scenes, command structures.
Being fundamentally retooled for speed and efficiency.
Right.
The sources mention new commands, like Joint Force Command Norfolk, focused on keeping those Atlantic supply lines open from North America to Europe.
Vital.
And the Joint Support and Enabling Command in Germany, designed to streamline logistics across the continent. The big goal, according to the sources.
Don't get caught flat-footed.
Exactly. To prevent the alliance from being caught flat-footed in a crisis. In essence, the sources state NATO is actively wiring itself to fight.
Okay, so NATO's adapting. What about the European Union, often seen as maybe slower on defense issues?
Well, the sources suggest the EU has also started acting with, frankly, surprising urgency in this area.
Like how?
The European Defense Fund, the EDF, is now coordinating billions with a B in R&D spending across member states, trying to stop everyone reinventing the wheel, pool resources.
AIM PESCO, permanent structured cooperation.
That provides a framework, a structured way for groups of countries to collaborate on specific defense projects. There are over 60 of these now.
Covering what kind of things?
Everything from developing new maritime drones to joint cyber rapid response teams. It's quite broad.
And that strategic compass document from 2022?
That outlined the EU's vision for a more credible, coherent defense posture. It specifically called for creating a 5,000-strong rapid deployment force.
Which has happened.
The sources note it's largely been created by 2025, alongside better crisis response tools and, crucially, enhanced coordination with NATO.
So it's not an EU army.
The sources are careful to point that out. It's not an EU army, no. But maybe something closer to an EU coherent security identity. That's the phrasing used.
And there was one initiative the sources highlighted as maybe underrated.
Military mobility. Yes. Funded jointly by the EU and NATO.
What's that about? It sounds boring but important.
It kind of is. It's not about building new weapons. It's about removing the bureaucratic and physical roadblocks to moving troops and heavy equipment across Europe quickly.
Like paperwork. And bridges.
Exactly. Things like strengthening bridges so they can actually handle the weight of modern tanks,
Mm-hmm.
standardizing rail gauges so trains don't have to stop at borders, digitizing customs procedures.
And crucially, the sources note this infrastructure has another use.
A dual use, yeah. It doubles as a way to move essential goods, food, medicine, fuel rapidly in a major crisis, not just military kit.
Okay, so collective defense is ramping up, but there's also this push, right, for Europe to build more of its own stuff, to be less reliant on, say, U.S. military tech.
Yes, slowly but determinedly. Europe is trying to rebalance that dependence by building indigenous capabilities through joint programs.
Like new fighter jets.
The Future Combat Air System, FCAS, is the big one. That's a Franco-German-Spanish partnership.
Aiming for what?
Developing a sixth-generation fighter jet, integrated drone swarms, advanced sensors, basically to replace the current Rafale and Eurofighter jets sometime around 2040.
And there's a rival project, too.
The Tempest project, yeah. Led by the UK, with Italy and Japan involved as partners, also aiming for a rival sixth-gen jet.
And these projects, the sources say, are about more than just new planes.
Fundamentally, the sources explain they're about achieving strategic independence in really critical defense technologies, not being totally reliant on others.
Makes sense. What about missile defense? That seems critical now.
Huge focus. NATO's overall integrated air and missile defense system is expanding. And then you have Germany's European Sky Shield initiative launched in 2022.
What's that?
It's a major effort to create a layered air defense network. Over 20 nations have signed on now, pooling resources to buy and operate systems like Patriot, the German Iris-T, and eventually maybe the Israeli Arrow 3 system.
Sounds ambitious.
The sources call it one of the most ambitious air defense projects in European history.
And beneath the waves, undersea warfare.
A significant boost in capabilities there, too. That Nord Stream pipeline sabotage really drove home the vulnerability of critical seabed infrastructure.
All those cables and pipelines?
Fiber optic cables carrying internet data, energy pipelines, communication lines, they're all down there. So
Yeah.
NATO and EU navies are increasing investments in seabed surveillance, anti-submarine warfare platforms, and unmanned underwater drones.
Protecting Europe's digital arteries, as one source put it.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah.
Okay, tanks, jets, ships, missiles, that's all vital. But the sources make another really compelling point.
About society.
Yeah, that wars aren't ultimately won just by militaries. They're won by societies that can, as they put it, absorb a punch and keep functioning.
Right, resilience.
So because of this, civil preparedness, getting the home front ready, isn't treated as an afterthought anymore. The sources say it's been elevated to a pillar of deterrence.
That phrase, pillar of deterrence, it really sticks with you, doesn't it?
It does, because the sources suggest that vulnerability isn't just on some far-off battlefield. It's just as real in, quote, the blackout, the hospital queue, or the disinformation feed.
So building resilience at home is just as critical as having tanks or planes.
That's the argument presented, yeah. And this focus means prioritizing things like energy resilience.
Which we touched on with the LNG terminals.
Exactly. That whole massive effort to restructure Europe's grid away from Russian gas, diversifying supply, building terminals, stockpiling fuel, it's fundamentally about security now.
And Norway, for example, has significantly increased its offshore patrols to physically protect energy infrastructure.
And Germany and the Netherlands, investing in decentralized renewables.
Which are inherently harder for an adversary to knock out completely compared to one big power plant, yeah.
Communications security is another critical area mentioned.
Absolutely. Hardening 5G networks against attack, protecting satellite systems, building redundant communication channels so if one goes down, others can take over.
And the EU's Cyber Resilience Act.
That's specifically mandating tougher security standards for a whole vast array of connected devices that you might use every day. Routers, smart grid components, anything that could be a weak link.
And transportation networks, too. Hardening those.
Intense scrutiny there, protecting critical rail hubs, ports, logistics corridors against both cyber and physical attacks. And remember that military mobility project.
Strengthening bridges, standardizing rail.
The sources really highlight its dual-use function again. It helps move tanks, sure, but it also helps move essential food and medicine quickly across borders in a crisis.
The sources also mention something that sounds almost nostalgic. Dusting off old civil defense manuals.
But completely rewriting them for the modern age, for hybrid warfare. Countries like Sweden and Finland are really leading the way here.
Reviving those Cold War-era programs.
Where every citizen is genuinely seen as part of the national defense effort. Finland's famous network of civilian bunkers, fully stocked with food and medical supplies, is part of this.
Along with plans to keep basic services running.
Detailed plans for maintaining social services, healthcare, power, water, even under extreme pressure.
And scenario planning is changing too, not just planning for one type of crisis.
Exactly. It's being completely retooled to handle these multi-domain overlapping threats. Like, how do you respond if you have a major power outage combined with a sophisticated cyber attack?
Or refugee flows may be mixed with a targeted disinformation campaign.
Or even a biothreat alongside a conventional military crisis. The drills now involve not just the military, but hospitals, schools, transport operators, local governments, everyone working together. Host speaker. And supply chain security. That became a huge issue during the pandemic. A quiet obsession now, according to the sources. COVID brutally exposed how vulnerable Europe was in critical goods, medical supplies, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals.
So now,
there's a concerted effort across Europe to rebuild strategic stockpiles of essential items, incentivize domestic production where it makes sense, and diversify imports for things like food, energy, medical supplies, reducing those single points of failure.
But none of this really works if the public isn't prepared or even aware of the risks, right?
Absolutely not. The sources state that public awareness itself is increasingly seen as a kind of battlefield.
A battlefield. How?
Well, think about disinformation, but also just basic preparedness. There's a real resurgence in crisis preparedness education.
Like that Swedish guidebook, Prepare for Crisis or War.
Exactly. Famously mailed to every household. You're seeing more school programs teaching this stuff, workshops for adults, emergency preparedness apps being developed and promoted, and crucially, there's pioneering work being done in disinformation resistance training.
Teaching people how to spot fake news.
Essentially, yes. Lithuania and Estonia particularly have been at the forefront. Public campaigns designed to teach citizens basic digital literacy skills, how to verify sources online, how to recognize automated bots spreading propaganda, how to identify influence operations trying to manipulate public opinion.
Digital literacy is a defense now.
The sources argue it's becoming as crucial as any physical defense.
And finally, some governments are even rethinking national service, but maybe not just military service.
Yeah, expanding the concept. Germany, for instance, is seriously debating some form of mandatory service that could involve roles in healthcare, logistics, or emergency response, not just the army.
France and Denmark are piloting a volunteer corps.
Voluntary Civil Service Corps, yes. The underlying message behind all of this, according to the sources, is simple but profound. Defense is everyone's responsibility. Okay, so beyond all the immediate preparations, Europe is also making some pretty significant investments in future technology. Recognizing, I suppose, that future conflicts will be defined as much by silicon as steel.
AI comes up a lot in the sources. Artificial intelligence.
It's central to the vision, embedded in command systems, potentially directing drone swarms, powering complex simulations for training and planning.
But Europe's playing catch-up there, isn't it, compared to the US and China?
The sources highlight that scramble, yes. Pouring resources into defense AI for applications like predictive maintenance for tanks or ships, or sophisticated battlefield analytics to understand what's happening in real time.
Are there specific initiatives?
Things like the EU's coordinated plan on AI, national defense labs in France and Germany are pushing hard. The UK, for example, is already trialing quite advanced human-machine teaming concepts.
Like robots and soldiers working together.
Integrating AI-controlled drones directly with special forces units, yeah. But what's particularly interesting reading these sources is that Europe isn't necessarily just racing ahead blindly with AI.
There are ethical concerns.
Ethical considerations seem to play a major role, perhaps more so than in some other regions. The EU's AI Act, even though it's mainly focused on civilian uses, has clauses that directly impact autonomous weapons.
Reinforcing human control.
Reinforcing the principle of meaningful human control over any life and death decisions made by machines. So there's this real tension described between the need for innovation and the commitment to, well, ethical restraint.
In space, that used to feel like a sanctuary, far from conflict.
Not anymore. The sources are explicit. Space is now seen as a contested domain. Those satellites we rely on for GPS navigation, for early warning of missile launches, for communications,
For vulnerable
Highly vulnerable.
Mm.
So Europe is investing heavily in protecting its space assets, building redundancy so if one satellite is knocked out, another can take over, and developing technology to detect and evade jamming or spoofing attacks.
France has a space command now.
Established a dedicated space command, yes. And the European Space Agency is working closely with NATO to monitor space traffic and protect critical assets up there.
And there's a big focus, too, on just knowing what's up there, space situational awareness.
Simply knowing what's happening above Earth, yeah. EU-funded programs are mapping space debris, tracking satellites friendly and potentially hostile, and monitoring potential threats.
Germany brought a new surveillance radar online in 2022.
Yes, and countries like Italy and Spain are developing constellations of small satellites specifically for observation and monitoring from orbit. And the sources even mentioned, kind of quietly, work being done on actual counter-space capabilities.
Thinking about how to counter an adversary's satellites. Yeah.
Yeah.
From sophisticated cyber tools that could disable them to maybe co-orbital technology, sending up a satellite to inspect or even disable another one without necessarily blowing it up and creating debris.
Because future wars might start in orbit.
The thinking is clear, as one source puts it. Future wars may begin with a blackout in orbit.
Okay, back down on Earth. Protecting critical infrastructure through really robust cybersecurity is obviously paramount.
Especially after attacks we've seen on hospitals, railways, pipelines.
Exactly. So countries are significantly tightening regulations. For example, through the EU's NIS2 directive, which mandates much stronger security requirements across all sorts of essential sectors.
And underlying this is a bigger strategic push, right, for digital sovereignty.
That's the term used, yeah. Basically, reducing reliance on foreign technology suppliers, particularly from China, but sometimes also the U.S., for critical digital infrastructure.
With cloud computing.
Initiatives like the German-led Gaia X aim to create a secure, European-controlled cloud and data infrastructure. There's also increased funding for homegrown European cybersecurity startups and efforts to build secure communication networks that don't rely on passing data through servers located in other countries.
Okay. Wow. So, taking all of this and the really complex threats, the regional and collective military buildups, this huge focus on civil resilience, the push into future tech, where does this actually leave Europe right now, according to these sources?
Well, the overall assessment seems to be that Europe is definitely more prepared for potential conflict than at any point since the Cold War ended. But the readiness is notably uneven. You have frontline states like Poland and Finland described as racing ahead, really mobilizing, while others, perhaps further from the perceived immediate threat, still significantly lag behind.
And key gaps remain.
Key gaps persist across the continent in critical areas like integrated air defense, military logistics, just moving stuff around efficiently, and comprehensive cyber resilience. And despite this collective push we've talked about, the sources indicate that those political fractures, they haven't gone away.
Disagreements over defense spending levels.
Spending levels, differing views on who the main threat really is, national interests pulling in different directions, all that continues to complicate efforts towards complete unity and interoperability.
So the path ahead, the sources argue, requires walking this incredibly difficult line.
Balancing credible deterrence and strategic dialogue, that's the tightrope.
Meaning?
Building real strength is essential to deter any potential aggression. But at the same time, skilled diplomacy is equally necessary to manage escalation, to avoid disastrous miscalculations.
So the challenge is staying firm, being prepared.
Without accidentally stumbling into the very war Europe is desperately trying to prevent.
And the sources conclude with this powerful historical echo.
Yeah, basically saying peace isn't preserved just by hoping for it. The warning signs back in the 1920s and 30s, leading up to World War II, were largely ignored.
And today?
Today, the sources contend, the signs are flashing once more. And the ultimate, really weighty question they leave us, the listeners, with is simply, will Europe act in time?
Wow. Okay. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground in this deep dive, drawing exclusively, as always, from the source material you've shared.
It's a lot to take in.
It really is. We've looked at the multidimensional nature of the threats Europe faces, everything from conventional military pressure and sophisticated cyber attacks to economic leverage and strategic tech theft. We've delved into those diverse, often very different regional responses right across the continent, examined the push for collective security through a seriously revamped NATO and more urgent EU initiatives.
Explore that critical, maybe underappreciated pillar of civil preparedness.
Getting the whole society ready. and touched on those vital investments in future technology, AI, space, cyber. Based on everything these sources present, the sheer scale and breadth of Europe's current preparations, it's genuinely unlike anything we've seen in decades.
And our aim throughout this deep dive, as always, has been to try and distill this incredibly complex picture, taking these detailed source materials and providing you, the listener, with that shortcut to understanding this really profound shift happening in European security thinking and action.
And drawing directly from the insights and the analysis presented in the source material today, it leaves us with that core, really challenging question that the sources themselves put forward for you to consider.
Yeah.
Based on everything we've discussed in this deep dive, do you think Europe can actually defend itself without the U.S.? And if it could, or if it had to, which country or perhaps entity is best positioned to take charge?
That's a huge question.
That's a crucial question to reflect on, isn't it? Given all this information we've unpacked today.